Hello and welcome back to your sermon study. We finished up our series called The Bible Doesn't Say That this week, and Pastor Phil Tagg discussed the common phrase, everything happens for a reason. Right out of the gate, it became clear that as a society, we're rather split on this issue. Some people find comfort in the idea that even the difficult things in life happen for some sort of reason we can't yet see. And then there are others who see that as a disturbing thought because it may essentially mean that God is the one who causes all sorts of horrible things to happen. So who's right? Phil said that in a way, both sides are right. It's true that everything happens for a reason in a literal sort of way. This is simple cause and effect. If I toss a ball in the air, it will eventually come back down. Human decisions and the laws of physics are, in a way, reasons for the things that happen. But Phil took us a step further by saying that while everything happens for a reason, God isn't the reason everything happens. While God does cause some events, we must be careful not to attribute everything to God. As Phil said, there is a very short gap between the idea that God is the reason behind everything and God is to blame for everything. The fact is, there are a lot of bad things that happen in this world. The Apostle Paul says that creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth. But we can't forget that God's original intention was not that this world would be full of suffering. When we humans decided to sin against God, we ushered pain into this world. So we can't blame God for our own poor choices. In fact, as Phil pointed out, in Romans 8, we read that the Spirit is interceding for us. In other words, rather than causing our suffering, God is actually fighting for us. Now, there's a verse in the Bible that says something that initially sounds very close to everything happens for a reason. It's Romans 8:28, and it goes like this. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This verse sounds like everything happens for a reason, but it is in fact completely different. To begin with, there's a tiny word there. It's the word in. In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. This means that while God may not have caused all things, He is working in and through them to shape us. It's telling that when Paul wrote this letter to the Romans, he was awaiting trial. He was suffering, and out of that suffering, he could write that God was still at work, even in that situation. So while God doesn't cause everything to happen, He can bring good out of anything. Sometimes the reason things happen is because of our own bad choices. We make bad decisions, and those decisions affect the lives of other people. But God can use even the worst situations to bring about His ultimate purposes. God doesn't make everything happen, but He does give everything that does happen a purpose. Now have a great discussion with your group. As a pastor, one of the most common questions I'm asked is, where was God? Where was God when my loved one died, or when I had cancer, or you name it? If God is so good, then why did such a horrible thing happen to me? These questions are some of the most difficult ones there are. I'll be honest, I don't think there is ever a perfectly satisfying answer. Nothing I can say will undo the pain that we feel in times of trial. However, there are some things that we do know. For example, as Christians, we have this remarkable belief that while pain and suffering are real, that doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. In fact, our faith contends that God is actually intimately involved in that suffering, hurting right alongside of us. Our suffering is God's suffering. We have a suffering God. In my opinion, one of the most moving examples of this is found in Matthew 27. Jesus is hanging on the cross and He's about to breathe His last. His disciples have scattered. He's been stripped and beaten. He knows that he's about to die. His final words here are, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? What's fascinating is that apparently Jesus knows what it's like to feel alone. The very heartache that we feel when we believe that God has abandoned us, Jesus himself knows that feeling. Now that alone is remarkable, but that's not all that we can learn from this. Many Christians have read Jesus' cry on the cross and assumed that indeed the Father must have abandoned Jesus, that Jesus was utterly alone and separated from God's presence. We even sing songs about how the Father turned his face away from Jesus on the cross. But was he really alone? Did the Father really abandon Jesus on the cross? To answer this question, we need more context. The fact is, Jesus was quoting from Psalm 22 when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 1 of the psalm reads, my God, why have you forsaken me? So far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Any Jewish person reading Matthew's gospel or standing within earshot of Jesus the day that he died would recognize where those words came from. Their minds would have immediately rewound to Psalm 22, where the very same words appear. But what's important is how the psalm ends. Whereas the writer of the psalm is clearly feeling abandoned by God in the beginning of the psalm, by the end of the psalm, we discover that he was really never alone. It says, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. God has not hidden his face from the afflicted. God hears their cries. This is the message of Psalm 22. This psalm is not about being abandoned by God. It's about the fact that even when we feel abandoned by God, God is still there. Now, what does this mean for Jesus' cry from the cross? It means that the Father did not abandon Jesus, but was there with him. The torment of crucifixion was endured by God himself, and so is your pain. While we may not be able to wipe away the difficulties of life, we can say without a doubt that our God does not stand far away watching us suffer, but rather dives headfirst into the heart of it. That is something I'm not sure any other belief system can say, but as Christians, we certainly can. Now have a great discussion.